Okay, I think we're starting to record. So let's stop this transcript. Okay, perfect. So colleagues, we are recording, so you've got a selection of this. Okay, so colleagues, as I said, so today we are working on the third chapter, which is innovation. Okay, thanks. Today we are working on the third chapter, which is the third study unit, which is innovative practices in the design, development, and implementation of educational technology. And I've chosen 5 outcomes. You will also see that I've refined some of these elements that we were supposed to discuss, because I will also cover some of these elements in study unit 4 and 5. For those, please remember, as I said earlier, we're trying to conclude this module by at least by 24th with all your submissions in. So next week, okay, so colleagues, if you're coming in, please mute yourself. Thanks. Yeah, so next week we will discuss study unit 4 and 5. And as I mentioned earlier, I've reduced the amount of readings for study unit 4 and 5, so we can actually combine the 2 units into 1 week. Now for this week, this is actually a very key. Last week in study unit 2, the theoretical principles and learning theories, and this week the innovative practices in the design, development, and implementation of education technology are literally the core units in this module, right? And this week we want to focus on some of the key elements. So there are 5 elements that I identified as outcomes that I want to achieve at the end of this course. The first one is we want to explain what the basic principles of embodied social learning is and its importance for online learning in Africa and South Africa. And I will unpack what social learning means in a bit. But just that first point is when we think of online, we must always think of these are students, these are academics, etc. But these are human beings that forms part of what we call digital citizenship. But they are human beings. So that means there's an embodiment of social learning that also needs to come across in these courses that we design for online. The second is the identify and discuss learning technology through 3 generations of online pedagogy. We discussed chapter 2, study unit 2, the theoretical principles, the technologies and pedagogies more specifically. And in this chapter, we want to build on those pedagogies and talk about what are the technologies that matches those learning pedagogies that we spoke about in chapter 2. Then in point 3, we want to talk about demonstrating an understanding of how communities of inquiry, right? So communities of inquiry, COI for short, drive teaching and learning in a digital age. So what does it mean for us in terms of creating communities of inquiry, creating communities of learners in a digital age? And then we also want to explain the basic tenets of mobile learning and its importance for Africa. And why I identify mobile learning as one of our key outcomes is because of our context. And if you recall right at the beginning when we started our orientation and our and our learning by our study unit 1, we flagged that the importance of mobile learning for Africa in terms of access, and this is has been one of the challenges for us in our own higher education context. We haven't actually harnessed to the full potential what
may I disturb you, Prof?
Yes, this way.
No, you can't see my hand. May I request that you increase the size of the screen?
Yes.
Struggling, I can't see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nelisa. No. Okay, is that better, Nelisa?
Better, thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. I keep forgetting that. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so the fourth one is the basic attendance to mobile learning. And as I said, we want to talk about mobile learning because of our context in Africa, and the issue of access, the issue of connectivity is critical for us. And it's been one of the areas that if we honest ourselves in the South African context specifically, we haven't actually fully harnessed the potential of mobile learning. So it's something that I want to touch a little bit about in point 4, the learning outcome 4. And the 5th learning outcome is, I always say that when we're doing courses like this, there must be a practical element of it, right? And what I want to do here is basically look at how do we design online activities for inclusive participation, right? What does this mean for us when we talk about designing an online activity? And it's not so simple as many of us think of just creating a discussion forum. If we don't create these forums the right way, if we do not scaffold these forums, we end up having very low participation in these spaces. So This is my goal. These 4 learning outcomes at the end of the day, right? And I've chosen 6 readings for you. So you will see some familiar names. So the first one is on social learning theory and web-based learning environments. The second reading by Prof. Moketsi Letseka on Ubuntu, in defense of Ubuntu in higher education, specifically in the digital space. And then Anderson and Dron, you are familiar with Anderson's approach to the pedagogies. Here we look at the learning technologies, matching those pedagogies that we spoke about in the last study unit. And then I also included another article by Terry Anderson on how communities of inquiry drive teaching and learning in the digital age. And then Errington, the idea of authentic mobile learning in higher education. And then the paper by the colleagues on active participation and lurkers. That's an important concept that I'll unpack as well. The idea of lurkers in an online space. So those are some of the 6 key readings that I've got identified for you. And these readings are not relatively long, so they are quite short and very concise in terms of what the objectives that we want to achieve that matches the 5 outcomes above. Now let's look at the introduction. Okay, so in the study unit, we want to focus on the different pedagogies in online learning. So we want to build on what we focused on study unit 2, right? So study unit 2, we went through the different pedagogies, the different learning approaches, and we have a good foundational knowledge now of what this means for us in terms of a distance learning context, in terms of online education, in terms of technology in education. But now we actually want to build on that. And we've seen that over the past years, one of the most common elements is our learning management systems has advanced much more in the space of the past decade. And some universities have just recently adapted learning management systems. Some have been using it for a few years. But what we've seen is a stronger social element, right? And when I say social element, I'm talking about a space for people to engage each other, engage in students, engage in peers. That has become quite strong in terms of how these learning managements are constructed. But we've also seen that in the past few years, for example, Facebook and to some extent Twitter, with Donald Trump's use of Twitter, gave a rebirth to Twitter. But Facebook and Twitter have been somehow the dominant. And now we're seeing Instagram as well, and the local one of TikTok. They are recent. I mean, the TikTok as well. They are taking on a more socially engaged spaces, right? And education is tapping into these spaces to see how we can utilize these tools as part of our broader expansion of our learning spaces. Just the other day, I thought TikTok everybody is now posting on their status update, WhatsApp status updates, some video on TikTok. And I thought to myself, let me quickly do a test a search on TikTok and see how much of education content. And what was fascinating is that whereas in Facebook and Twitter, you'll find all your major Ivy League universities that have already started to utilize these spaces. But TikTok, not much has started happening in that space. And I think here it's obviously the limitation in terms of time of the videos as well. But it's interesting to see what happens in the next few years in terms of TikTok, considering the fact that it is drawing on a very large crowd of people in terms of as a dissemination of information platform. Now, the social element has become a lucrative business. Now, we know, for example, in the technology industry, right from the beginning, if you can harness social elements in these community social networks, it's one way you've got people tapping into the space. But what does it mean for us when we think of our students who are active participants in Facebook, in Twitter, Instagram? What does it mean for us when we think of students' expectations from us in terms of our learning management system, in terms of our learning spaces that we've now put together? Do they expect that social element as part of this? Do we integrate those social elements as part of our use of technology in these spaces? And this is important, and especially for us in the African context, where we've preached this, we've studied this, is that it's a very community-based continent. So it means that we can't ignore the fact that we have learners who are social beings. And that idea of autonomous learner does not restrict or does not alienate the social elements of our learning approaches. Now, learning technologies have expanded on this, and we've seen them becoming and integrating much more in terms of the social experience. And maybe we need to start thinking that through this point in the last part here, is maybe we need to start thinking of learners as a community online. And if we start thinking of learners as a community online, what does that mean for us, right? So to unpack this entire introduction, the subthemes in the study unit are technology and the embodied learner, learning technologies through 3 generations of pedagogies, communities of inquiry in teaching and learning in a digital age, mobile learning, or some may find the concept M-learning, then designing online learning activities, right? So let's work through these, colleagues, as we start unpacking of it. So we start with first the technology and the embodied learner. Just to remember that when you get to these subthemes, you simply click on it and it opens up the subpage. So hoping we get a bit faster. Yeah, it seems as though our load shedding has really taken an effect on how we communicate in some of these spaces. Okay, so let's begin by unpacking what we mean by social learner, right? And why this is important for the online context. Now, social learning theory, for those that are in the education context, this was the fundamental seminal person that has brought this, Albert Bandura. And in his publication entitled Social Learning Theory, Bandura explained social learning theory as learning would be exceedingly laborious, not to mention hazardous, if people had to rely solely on the effects of their own actions to inform them what to do. He states, fortunately, most human behavior is learned observationally through modeling, right? So the concept of modeling here is quite important. From observing others, one forms there an idea of how new behaviors are performed, and on later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action. So he sees this idea of online, of social learning as a way of modeling behavior. And I thought to myself, this is quite interesting because if we really start engaging in some of our online spaces, we find that people start to model behavior online, right, on social networking sites. They send trends are set and people start following those trends of engaging, etc. So what does it mean for us if we think of our students, our learners, as social beings who start modeling social behavior in an online platform, right? So here's a video by Albert Bandura, where he starts unpacking, right? And he starts to unpack what we mean by the type of social cognitive theory, right? And I want you to watch this video by Albert Bandura. And when you finish, watch the video. All I want you to do is simply discuss this, how Bandura's idea of modeling can influence student learning in an online environment, right? And you simply post your comments here. So what he talks about is quite interesting. He talks about the idea, as I said, is students mimic other students in online space. And we see this, as I said earlier, we see this in online social media. We see this on Facebook. We see this on Twitter, responses, etc. So how can we then start to theorize how modeling behavior can be incorporated in a technology-mediated learning space, right? And this is why we start talking about, as we start unpacking the idea of modeling, it comes through very strongly the idea that we are social beings even when we engage in online spaces. We don't lose the essence of who we are. And that's what he's talking about, the idea of the essence of a learner that is not lost as we start mediating the online learning spaces, right? Now, his idea of social learning in design, development, and implementation of what he calls in terms of web-based learning environments, WBLEs, right? So over the past decade, we've seen cognitive psychology dominate many of our teaching learning approaches. We've also seen this come across in terms of learning analytics, where we want to study how students behave in these online spaces. But the core of this article by Ilsong and West argues that the following must be considered as we advance into more technology-mediated learning spaces. So they point to 3 important elements. First, is learners' individual characteristics in web-based learning environments, which means that, and this is something that we need to think about, is that while technology brings our learners together as a community of participants, we don't lose the identity, or the learner does not lose their identity, their behavior patterns, their learning styles as an individual in these web-based learning environments. So which means that we still need to think about the individual characteristics of our students in these spaces, right? Now take, for example, typically in your classroom setup. And if you have 50 students in your class doing a course, out of those 50 students, you may have a variety of learners sitting there that have a different identity and approach to learning, right? Now, if that is them in a classroom setup, we need to think of the virtual space as a virtual classroom in which these individuals function, which means that we need to acknowledge the individual characteristics of our learners in these spaces, right? Secondly, is strategies for promoting social interaction in web-based learning environments. Is the second point stresses that we need to start thinking of, and this is why I keep drawing on a classroom setup to a virtual learning space, is that in a classroom space, you will try to engage those students that are not participating. You will try to ask them questions. You'll try to prompt them to respond to you in your physical classroom. The exact same principles work in a technology-mediated space such as web-based learning environments. It means we need to think of these students as students sitting there, X, Y, Z. And we need to start thinking beyond that, to start picturing these students. How do we then motivate these students to participate in an online learning space? Now, remember, technology can be innovative, can create these new opportunities for us to disseminate knowledge, make our causes more interesting. But if our students are not active participants in these spaces, the technology means nothing, because it cannot accomplish anything without the students harnessing the potential of these technologies. The third is to develop effective design principles for web-based learning environments. And effective means exactly what I've just unpacked, is to bring students to the point of where they can engage each other effectively, right? Part of the learning process, but part of the building of a community of practice as well as part of these, right? So these three strategies by Ilsong and West talks about when we consider technology-mediated learning spaces, whether it's your learning management system, whether it's a Facebook page, whether it's a WhatsApp group, these are all strategies that forms part of how we use the tool, the technology tools, to design the learning that we want to put forward. Now, applying constructs from social learning theory. And what Ilsong and West do, they identify three important constructs that influence social learning perspectives online: context, culture and community, and learner characteristics, right? So it's context, culture and community, and learner characteristics. Now, context, and we spoke about this last time, context is really, it really drives everything that we want to do as an academic, as an institution, as a facilitator. The context dictates what we and how we deliver our content, right? So let's look at this first construct. So Ilsong and West, when they talk about understanding cognition facilitates understanding, they start with context, but they unpack this as context is based on understanding of interactions, whose interactions? Interactions between the student and students, so it's peer-to-peer interactions online, and then it's facilitator or academic or lecturer interaction with the students, right? So interactions are key for context. So context drives interactions. Secondly, context drives group and class size. Now, this is important because when we talk about context in the second point, we're talking about the institutional profiling of your context. So you may have large modules that are quite big, depending on whether these disciplines are attractive to our students. And then you may have the smaller modules as well. So the group size and class size also dictates how students participate in the online space. Now, this is an interesting point, is that some of you may argue that the larger the group, the better the communication in an online space. But that's not actually true, because what we found is that when you have large groups, for example, 2,000 students in an online space, you may only have 10% of those students performing at the level that you have designed your course, which means only 200 students of those 2,000 may be engaging actively. But then you may have a smaller course that has 50 students, and you may have 25 students that are engaging. Now, at first glance, you may think, 50 versus 200 doesn't make sense. But if you take the 50 and the 25 of the 50, that means you got 50% of the smaller groups participating. And what I found is that the smaller groups tend to be much more effective in terms of online communication and participation, as opposed to the larger groups, because students can hide in numbers. So it's a matter of, and this is quite important, is the group size and class size. How do you facilitate online interactions when it comes to these different scenarios, right? And then resources, the resources that you can use to promote this, right? Context, what resources drives your integration of these learning spaces? We know that interactions imply that knowledge is constructed while students engage in activities, receive feedback, and participate in forums, interactions, social context. So, for example, knowledge is constructed when you are providing feedback on the online forum, like some of you have done. Knowledge is when you have our discussions online, we're constructing knowledge, interaction. When you are completing your essays, etc., your portfolios, those are interactions with the content. Those are part of the learning process, right? And an important element of interaction, as I said, the second one is group size, and I spoke about that. And then the third element is resources. When we talk of resources, it's supported by a variety of modes of interaction. And here, this is important, colleagues. And as you will see, if you take a note of how we design this course, specifically this course, it's not purely text-based, right? So there's text, there's video, there's sound. There are three mediums, text, video, and sound, that dominates these spaces. And what that means is the interaction. When you watch a YouTube video, you are interacting with a video and sound. In some cases, you are also interacting with text where you have to respond to those videos. So the idea of diversifying interaction, and this is where, one of the greatest challenges for us in the South African context is that when we talk about online learning, the misnomer that we have is we think, for example, our study material, we can PDF it and put it on our online learning management system, and that becomes online learning. That is actually just PDF, what we term PDF behind glass. Right? It is not online learning. So online learning, educational learning, technology integrated learning must see videos, sound, text, etc. as part of the delivery approach of how we deliver the content, right? That is online education. That is technology education. So it means not just using the medium as PDF behind a glass. It means blending the type of technology to promote that learning approach, right? And by integrating diverse resources, what we find is that students can explore different ways of learning. And this has become quite profound. And there's something that I'm actually picking up right now at the moment in some of our courses that I'm teaching, is that while we've always flagged videos as, this innovation resource, but I'm actually seeing a subculture emerging. And this subculture emerging is towards audio and podcast. So what I'm finding is that students are now preferring to actually listen to a podcast while they are working or doing something else, or multitasking, or listen to a podcast while they're getting ready in the morning or while they are driving. So the idea of podcast sound is becoming a very critical medium of how we disseminate our learning approaches. So there's a subculture that is emerging, that is moving away from video to now think of podcasts. And I thought to myself, why podcast? And immediately it comes to mind is the simple accessibility of podcasts. It is cheaper to stream than video, firstly. Secondly, it is easier to integrate in your daily lifestyles as opposed to video that you have to sit down and watch. So podcasts are becoming quite critical and a very strong medium to attract our students in terms of disseminating knowledge, right? So that's something that you, in the back of your mind, think to example of how the space is evolving to not just technology that is available, but to contextual technology that speaks to the student's context from where he or she is coming. And that's something that we need to do. But there's another side to this coin. And what I've also seen is that those academics that are afraid psychologically and mentally to be behind a camera where the students are viewing them, physically seeing their facial expressions, are also opting for this way of podcast. So they are able to talk and converse and simply record it, right, and then send it through. The accessibility issue also now becomes quite critical when we start thinking of, for example, the accessibility to, for example, cheap mediums such as WhatsApp. It's lesser, faster, lesser to cost to send a video audio clip as opposed to a video clip. So these are some of the elements that are actually driving these subcultures that are now emerging in our university context. So the debate has moved, the discourse and debate, colleagues, has moved beyond this in South African context. We're not, and this is what I always say to our colleagues, it's not about the nice to have. We all like the technology, the nice to have technology in our institutions. We all like to brag about the innovative studios that we have. But it's also about whether those technologies are applicable to our learning context, are applicable to our student profiles. And this is where we now need to shift the debate and discourse to, right? The second point on culture and community. The issue of culture and community is critical. And here we know that in the South African context, we've got diverse social races, cultures, religions, etc. So what does that mean for us in an online space? Can we now ignore those factors of gender, race, culture, religion, etc. in an online space? When an individual now sits behind a computer and is talking to their fellow students, and talking to you as an academic, they refer to those worldviews as part of their points of reference, right? So it means we cannot ignore that we have an online culture and community of students that are diverse, which also means that when we start talking to our students, we need to think that although we are talking behind a medium technology mediated space, that our points of reference, the way we engage our students through these technology mediums, must also embody those diversities so that the students can understand and build links to what we are saying, right? Now, this becomes a bit more complicated. It's not so simple as that, because it also now matters. It also now refers to you simply knowing your student profile, right? Because it's like when you're sitting in your podcast and you're relating to examples of points of reference to that particular discipline, you need to make sure that you cater for those different students that are hearing what you are saying as part of this, right? And this becomes important. So even, for example, when we start integrating technology and media, for example, videos, etc., that point of reference now needs to become much more clearer so that students can associate with what we are putting out, right? And the notion of community also often offers opportunity for us to redefine culture. And this is important. So we talk about physical culture and we talk about online culture, right? So remember, the other element is that one of the things that we have and that is emerging is the idea of students developing different identities when they come into an online space. We do this. For example, many of us choose what we want to put on Facebook, right? We don't just put everything on Facebook. We choose what we want to put on Facebook. So by choosing what we want to put on Facebook, we are creating an impression of ourselves that we want to get out of there. So it's not like real life TV where Facebook has got a permanent camera on you and any of your friends, part of your network can just log on and see exactly what you're doing at any part of the time. It's not that reality TV, right? So it's selective exposure of who we are, right? The same thing works on different social platforms. So, and the same thing works in our online spaces. Our students are selecting what they want to show us as part of the space, which means we have a sub-community, sub-culture in this online community that is now being developed. And that forces us to also rethink our identity of students. Now, for example, a typical example that I found quite interesting in our own context is that you have a group of 50 students, and I know for a fact that our student profile, and we do this research, so out of that 50 students, I know there are students that come from really deep rural areas that have limited connectivity, and they say that to me in emails when they are communicating with me. But in the online space, when they are communicating with their peers, that identity, they don't want to be shown because they don't want to show this identity of a learner that is coming from a rural area. They want to show this identity of a learner that is part of this bigger community of group, irrespective of where they are. So there are elements of how they create this impression, this identity of themselves in these online spaces, which means we need to now start thinking more strategically of profiling our students, not just in physical space, but also in our online spaces. And by profiling our students in the online spaces, we are able to see how our students are becoming adapted into these community of practices that are putting on, right? So it's an interesting evolving of our students in these online spaces, right? Learner characteristics, and here can be divided into four factors that affect social learning: epistemological beliefs, individual learning styles, self-efficacy, and motivation. And epistemological beliefs refers to one's belief about definition, construction, evaluation of knowledge, where that knowledge comes from. And we know in the South African context, one of the biggest issues that have now been coming about is the issue of Africanization, decolonization. So those larger debates also comes into these spaces, right? The second is on self-efficacy, refers to learners' confidence in engaging with new tasks, activities. Motivation can be divided into intrinsic motivation with its personal interest, and extrinsic, meaning the outside response to external factors such as prize giving or points given as part of completing an activity. Okay, so those are the different dimensions when we talk about learner characteristics in the online space, right? So the motivation factor for me is quite important, is that when we start designing online learning activities, as you will see later, is what motivates our students to complete those activities. What motivates our students to engage in discussion forums? What motivates our students to start doing blogs, for example, right? That motivation is something that we need to shape as part of this. So what I want you to do then is discuss how epistemological beliefs as part of activity 3.2. Now, remember, colleagues, as I mentioned last time, these activities are designed to help you to work through your portfolio questions at the end of the day so that you start thinking about it. So they are activities that prompts you to start thinking about things, which later I want you to apply when you are doing your portfolio questions. And here simply I want you to discuss the epistemological beliefs, individual learning styles, self-efficacy, and motivation that can impact online teaching, and provide a link to your answer, provide your response to your answer in the comments tab. Then I integrated the article by Prof. Moketsi Letseka, who's actually holds the IODL chair at UNISA on online education technology. And he talks about the idea of Ubuntu. Now, many of us know what the concept of Ubuntu is, but what is interesting about his idea is the adaptation of Ubuntu to the online space, of how he sees a learner being a learner as part of a community of other learners in an online space, right? And that's something that is important for us, because what we need to think about, and this is the idea of humanness, personhood, and morality, right? And what I found quite interesting here is that when we talk of the postmodernist discourse, etc., and how people are shifting it, especially in the digital space, of towards artificial intelligence, towards robotics, etc., the biggest discussion is whether we are not losing our humanity in the process of moving towards artificial intelligence, right? And what the article by Prof. Letseka does is it really flags back onto us thinking of ourselves as human beings in a digital space. And sometimes it forces us to rethink, for example, when our students have issues that they can't access technology, right? It's very easy for us to say, or if a student logs on and the student says, I don't know how to do this activity, I don't know where to click, I don't know what to do, right? Many of us will simply, you should have known this because it's part of your course, you should have got the skills before, why didn't you ask somebody to get this? That kind of interaction immediately will push that student to not ask you any questions thereafter, right? So here, the idea of Ubuntu talks about the idea of us being tolerant, understanding difference, understanding diversity, understanding the challenges that emerges in these spaces. And one of the biggest challenges, colleagues, for us in the technology space is the frustration of academics in dealing with technical issues, right? And sometimes what we find is that is projected onto our students. And that becomes a challenge because that projection of technology deficiency, digital literacy deficiency, becomes a stumbling block for our students not to ask any questions, not to engage in these spaces. And this makes it a complete different space. So when we talk about Ubuntu, we're also talking about us understanding that the integration of technology in our learning spaces has not been for a couple of decades. It's relatively new, which means that we are all finding our spaces together. We are all finding this learning part together, which means that the same kind of approach to how we engage academics, each other, we should also be engaging our students in that type of online interaction, online engagement, right? And here, what I would like you to do is read Prof. Letseka's article on Ubuntu, and in more specific on his idea of how learners in higher education, the promotion of Ubuntu-oriented attributes disposition. And think of this one Ubuntu attribute or disposition mentioned by Prof. Letseka, why you think it's invaluable, for example, the teaching and learning space, the tutoring spaces, or whatever space you want to call it, right? And then explain how you will build this attribute into your teaching spaces, right? And then explain why do you think this is an attribute important for you. Now, what was interesting for me was, and this is something that I came across in the course of this week. So, for example, we're training a group of teaching assistants now as part of preparing them for next year, and it's a cohort runs from next week to mid-December. And normally what we do is we try to blend the learning spaces. So we've got the online course, and exactly what we're doing here in this class, we've got the WhatsApp group, right? And I created the WhatsApp group with about 400, 300. It's a maximum of 300, and then the second WhatsApp group, so we have about 400 or so complete, basically on 2 different WhatsApp groups. And the first thing, the course only starts officially next week, but the first thing that these teaching assistants did was they started to go and start their own WhatsApp groups regionally. Right, so they started asking, who's in KZN, please pick your hand up. Can we start a separate WhatsApp group? Who's in Pretoria? Who's in Joburg? Start a separate WhatsApp group. Now, that was never my intention. The intention of a single WhatsApp group was to create a community of practice. But before I could even engage them officially, which only starts next week, they've already started creating these sub-learning groups. Now, what was interesting about this point was that the regional dynamics is that people preferred to work with people in their own regions as opposed to across the country. And one of the teaching assistants asks this question. He says, but why are you dividing the group when we could all just work together. And the response that came out from 90% of these people on the WhatsApp group was that it makes it easier for us to discuss this regionally as opposed to nationally. Now, I thought that was quite interesting, because what that actually means is that there's a regional identity of our students also emerging, right? And if you have students from all over different parts of your different provinces or different parts of the city, you tend to see those dynamics happening in these technology spaces, right? And that's interesting because you're now seeing a different understanding of community, which becomes a localized view of community in these online spaces. And that's something that is quite interesting for us in our institutional context, is to think about how people prefer these different spaces of communities that are critical for them. So colleagues, this is an important section on the social element. And why I thought this was important is because before we can even start thinking more strategically about technology integration, we need to start right at the beginning and think of our students as social beings. And that for me is the main part behind this. Okay, let me stop here. Any questions on this, colleagues? Any points that you want clarity on? Any comments from your side? You can just pick up your hand if you want to respond. Anything that you found in your own context, if you're going to share some of the examples in your own context, yeah, please feel free. Yes, Edgar, thanks. The floor is yours. You can just unmute Edgar.
Okay, thanks, Prof. This aspect of Prof. Letseka is quite interesting, mainly because in the context of our university in Limpopo, most of our students and in majority they come from rural settings. And when you introduce them to education through technology, is always a challenge. And some will need you as an instructor to hold their hand.
Yeah.
And that's where Ubuntu comes in, that without others, you might not make it on your own.
Yeah.
A human being is not an island. Exactly. So I've experienced it a lot with our students. They will struggle, and some will ask. Some students might be difficult to consult with the lecturer. They will rather seek guidance from their peers, which is also part of these particular attributes of Ubuntu. I just wanted to share that with you. It is a very pragmatic theory, and we all experience it in our settings.
Thanks, Edgar. I think you're on point, and I like the point on students actually preferring to ask other students as well when they have those challenges. That's on point. Mbele, floor is yours. You can unmute.
I just wanted to share as well a similar example to yours, Prof. So what I did with my class, because we use Teams and Moodle, and they really struggle to log into Moodle. But if you create a class on Teams and that one they can easily access. So I put all my information on how to log into Moodle on the Teams class, and that helped them. And I also created a group, and I posted a link on Teams, so the first time they log in, they can see that there's already a WhatsApp group created, so they can just join the group via that link. So in that way, I was able to have all of my class or all of my students before we even started with the online teaching, and they already were asking questions on how to log in if they were having difficulties following the instructions that were on the Teams class. And once they were on Moodle as well, I tried to motivate them. I started a discussion forum where I posted a video of myself introducing myself to them, and I asked them to kind of post a photo of themselves and a little bit of information just to introduce them to the class. Because the main idea was that they are all over and they don't know each other, but if there's a space where they can kind of know, oh, this one is maybe here in Peter Marisburg next to me, we can start studying together, for instance. And even on the class group as well, they started chatting like that, asking who's in this res, for instance, can we kind of meet so we can start studying together, which was it was very motivating for me that they are starting to have these interactions with each other before they even start with the course. So I think it was kind of a great idea, and it's something that I want to do every year now, so that my students have contact with each other. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share.
That's actually brilliant. You as you're speaking, I actually realized something. We should have actually did this as part of our own group. We should have actually applied something like that to see how we all engage with it. To simply have said, post up a photograph of yourself or your family on the WhatsApp group and say one comment. And I think that would have worked actually quite nice for us to see who the person is, to understand the person. And that actually helps. That's actually a powerful example. I want to congratulate you on that, because I think that's the bringing the human side of our students onto the platform. And that's actually a very good example. So congratulations on that. I think that's a good use of technology for that. So well done on that.
Thank you, Prof. And it was quite interesting because they were sharing quite good stories. Like they were telling me stories of some were personal, but it was kind of interesting because I got to know them in that kind of an intimate way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. They will tell me stories that, I took a gap year and I wanted to travel. Someone will tell you, like, I had this kind of a sickness, or so I wanted. It was just a nice way of just knowing them at that personal level. But and the other thing is, you now that it's level one, you go to campus and you go there not having met them, but with that I can go to their photo, although it's hard to remember all of them, but when you've seen someone, you can kind of say, I've seen this face before, and
Right.
that's one of my students.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
it was nice in that way as well.
Oh, no, that's
Thank you.
interesting. Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. I see MZ posted up a comment on language. Yes, language preference works quite well, and I think that's in the African context for us is quite an interesting dilemma. Is where students prefer to have those the groups based on their own languages. That's something that I think we need to do a lot of research into the language preferences. But I think it's very visible in our institutions, the languages. So thanks, MZ, for that. I see there's one more hand. So just quickly here. Naeem, the floor is yours.
Hi there. Sorry, my first thing, I apologize for the noise around me. I had to find somewhere where I could get some sort of connectivity. I just wanted to share project that I did last year, which was a COIL project, a collaborative online international learning project with my extended curriculum program students in collaboration with a university in the United States. And in terms of technology, I found that initially our students, our South African students, thought that we're lacking behind in technology. Only once they started actually collaborating, they actually realized that internationally the challenges are the same. So we created teams which had equal participants from a South African university and a university in the United States. And from there, these teams created their own WhatsApp groups. And we actually used Facebook as a medium of communication, where we created a closed group on Facebook and the students came on and they actually did the entire project on Facebook, including submitting their work. And I found that in terms of technology, they were quite fine with using Facebook as a medium. They use WhatsApp as a medium. And the one thing that we also did in terms of introducing the students to each other, they had to come on and do a video individually. The video, they had to say their name, give an explanation of what their name means, and they had to say one phrase in their mother tongue. And to now, a year later, these students that have collaborated internationally are still friends on Facebook, on WhatsApp, with these students in the United States. The second thing I wanted to highlight, and I found that was very interesting, was that students that were not at all collaborating in the class, they would not talk, they would just keep quiet. When it came to an online space, they were phenomenal. And for me, that just showed me, or it taught me, that I have to introduce a blended teaching approach, because all students learn differently. Some will learn via a PowerPoint, some via a video, and other ones via group discussion. And that's whether we're using an online platform or face-to-face platform. And I found that I actually get excellent results from using that blended approach. And I learned that from actually doing like my COIL project. So I thought I'd just like to share that with colleagues, because I think that it's very interesting in terms of technology internationally as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Naeem. I think that's actually a profound example. I mean, I like the way you spoke about the internationalization and communication across, integration of Facebook and WhatsApp as well, and the extension of that. That's quite interesting. And I think the added last point on the fact that some students prefer this space as opposed to in the classroom where they'll be quiet. So colleagues, this is quite fascinating, because I mean it's just not theory. We actually see it in practice with some of the colleagues' examples, that this works. It works. We have our challenges, but the idea of us rethinking, reinvesting, and as somebody put this point, I think, in the chat, it's time for our universities to invest in technology, because this is the way we can really expand our learning spaces, get our students on board. And I think the effectiveness of our learning approaches we will start to see the results of throughput, student retention, etc. as part of this. So thank you very much, colleagues, for sharing some of those really interesting examples that you brought to the fore. So colleagues, we move now to learning technologies to the 3 generations of pedagogy. Now remember, this article is on the backdrop of this article in Study Unit 2, where you spoke about the 3 generations of pedagogy, right? So now here in this article, we're actually looking at the matching of those technology to those spaces. So for example, the idea of the cognitive and the behaviorist pedagogy, the first pedagogy, right? And here it talks about, for example, audio, teleconferencing, etc., that is used to bridge the cognitive behaviorist pedagogy. So there's a limited element of pedagogy here, technology, but there is elements of technology, right? And if we look at how this particular model, so you have an activity 3.4. To complete this activity, you need to read the article firstly above, because this extraction is from the article, this diagram extraction. What are the main characteristics of Dick and Carey's 1985 model of instructional design? Now remember, this concept, instructional design, I'm not sure how many of you have heard it, but this is very important, right? So when we talk about technology integration, we talk about instructional design. And instructional design means how, where, and why we are integrating technology into our teaching approaches. And the how means, quite importantly, is what type of technology, how are we going to integrate it? The why reinforces what we are talking about in terms of the motivation behind our technology creation. And so these are critical elements, right? So what I want you to look at the article and start looking at these components of identifying instructional goals, conduct instructional analysis, write performance objectives, develop criterion, develop instruction strategy, develop formative evaluations. So this cycle that comes out from Anderson and Drons is how technology needs to be integrated, not just we want to use a discussion forum, not just we want to use a blog. What is the imperativeness, the important, the goal behind our technology integration into these elements, right? Then the social constructive approach, which I spoke about last week and flagged quite importantly, the idea of what type of technologies, and here we're talking of interaction technology, synchronous and asynchronous tools, right? So synchronous, colleagues, remember, is in real time, right? Synchronous in real time. So for example, like WhatsApp can be real time and delayed time. Asynchronous is delayed. So here we're looking at, for example, how people construct knowledge, new knowledge as building upon the foundation of previous learning, context in shaping learners' knowledge development, learning as an active rather than passive process. So for example, drawing from examples that you all have just said, Naheem and the others, of our students are contributing towards the learning process. They're active learners, right? They're not just passive. Language and other social tools in constructing knowledge, and I think Emsley, this is important in the point that you've raised, is the preference of language, right? And then the metacognition and evaluation that means to develop learners' capacity to assess their own learning, learning environment, and knowledge needing to be subject to social discussion, validation, application in real world context. So this is when we talk of the basic characteristics of the social constructive approach, right? And then you have an activity here. List and discuss 3 technologies that Anderson and Drun include in social constructivist pedagogy. As part of that article, they address what could be used. How can these tools be used strategically in your own teaching or tutoring space to provide student support, right? And then connectivist pedagogy. Now, this is the important one, remember, and I will flag this a little bit more when we get onto the mobile connectivity, the M-learning one. But we discussed this last week as well, the idea of the connectivist approach, the actor network theory, the I levels of skills in using personal learning networks. And what I would also like you to unpack is to think about your own personal learning network, right? And I mentioned this previously as well, is if I had to ask you as a researcher, as a teacher, educator, etc., what informs your own personal learning network? And many of you would say different things. For example, some would say I draw my information from online journals. I draw my information from search engines that I use to search keywords, or my library facility may have a online search facility. Some people may also refer to open resource places where articles are published, such as ResearchGate, Academia Edu. Those are all learning spaces that we tap into. But they also become our own personal learning networks, because when we tap into learning spaces, we tap into those spaces that we have our preference for. So, for example, the moment you want to see what articles are available in the academic space on open learning, you go to Google Scholar, search on open learning, and you'll find a vast array of stuff, right? If I wanted to find information on lectures that are done at some of these Ivy League universities, I go to YouTube. And I watch those videos because that's where you find the professors are engaging, some reputable professors are engaging with critical discussions, and some of them actually record their lectures and throw it up on the open spaces. So you may not have a synchronous live in the live classroom experience, but you'll have a asynchronous experience through YouTube of that particular lecture, right? And then you need to think about the focus on creation as opposed to consumption of information resources. So connectivist approach talks about how we produce knowledge, not just consume knowledge, but how we also produce knowledge. There's a third point in the connectivist approach. So it's consuming knowledge means you are literally eating the knowledge, you are gaining from the knowledge, reading from the knowledge, benefiting from the knowledge. Creation of knowledge means you are creating new knowledge. So you're adding new knowledge onto the space and you're throwing it out in an open space. But there's a third dimension which is now also emerged, which is called the curation of knowledge, right? And the connectivist approach allows me to curate knowledge. So you've heard of RSS feeds, etc. So I can curate knowledge through technology mediums. That means I can use these platforms to curate knowledge on the specific themes, specific events, and that's called the curation of knowledge, right? The third element that comes out quite importantly. So aligning pedagogy to technology. And here, colleagues, there's no way we can understate Bloom's taxonomy, right? But the idea of Bloom's taxonomy in a digital space also becomes quite important, because there's a shifting in his thinking of and readaptation in the digital space. And what I would like you to do is look at Bloom's taxonomy. It should be the basis of how we formulate our assessments, how we formulate our teaching, what type of outcomes we want, what type of competency we want. So these are important elements when we start to shape knowledge using technology, that we start thinking of more critically. the idea of understanding, comprehension versus understanding, application, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. And if you look at how Bloom's taxonomy applies the digital elements to these components, it's quite critical, because when you, for example, when we talk about the latter part on designing learning activities, you'll find that we need to think critically on where we want to position this as part of our elements, right? So let's move on to the next one. So this is where he talks about the 3 pedagogies, and I want you to think more specifically when you read this section on going back to the study unit 2, specifically the pedagogies that we looked at in terms of the learning theories. Okay. Now we can see the effect of network connectivity across the country. Okay, so the next one we look at now is communities of inquiry. And this is also an article by Anderson and Dron. And here, it's by Anderson. Anderson talks about how communities of inquiry drive teaching and learning in the digital age. Now, this is an old model that he has formulated, the COI model for short. We call it the Community of Inquiry model, the COI. And he talks about what are the skills and abilities needed for facilitators and students to leverage the power of communities of inquiry, right? What lessons can be learned from the growth of peer-to-peer learning and assessment which supports community of inquiry approach? So, for example, and this becomes a bit of a challenge in our own context, where we have, we can talk about peer-to-peer groups, group learning, group work, group assessments. The challenge with that is those students that may not have efficient connectivity may struggle. But on the positive side, the potential, as some of you have already mentioned, for thinking of peer-to-peer learning groups, peer-to-peer assessment approaches, working in groups through technology, it means that irrespective of which geographical region your student could be on, based on simple preference on language or preference on a particular topic or approach to learning, students could form their own networks across the country, internationally. And this is what becomes important when we think of a community of inquiry that transgresses or evolves beyond our normative understandings of boundaries, right? And this is an important element of how technology now mediates communities of inquiry in our institutions, right? Then what can emerging technologies contribute to this space? What are the best practices present and emerging possibilities for community of inquiry model? And what are some of the examples of community inquiry approach? These are literally what Anderson talks about in his article. He tries to flag out as being the important elements when he starts talking about the community of inquiry as a way for us to think of communities of inquiry, communities of learners, communities of participation in an online digital space, right? Now, one of the main attributes of the COI model is that it adapts to a variety of intercultural contexts, integrates new technologies, supports distributed learning. And this is an important concept, colleagues. Distributed learning means learning across different platforms. It includes both synchronous and asynchronous. And you find that I use these 2 words so much in educational tech in this course and literally in many of the other presentations, is because we must differentiate between synchronous and asynchronous and the potential between both these technologies for us in our education institution, right? And this is one of the challenges that we have, is many of us think of our learning management systems as asynchronous, that our students will post up their comments, their discussions whenever they got time, and we will then respond when we got time. And some of our institutions, and I know we're guilty of this, we say in 24 hours we will respond, and I can guarantee you that when it comes to maths classes, that's not possible. But the potential of the same technology being used synchronous. So for example, I can use this learning management platform and say to all of you between in the next hour, we will go online. Please join onto the chatbot, on the chat tab, and we will have a discussion on XYZ. That means X amount of students can go on, log on, and they can talk in real time on these platforms, literally as you would do in the classroom, but virtually. So this is something that we need to think about, is a community of inquiry that incorporates both synchronous and asynchronous technologies to achieve its objectives, right? Now, as part of the evolution of the COI, Anderson highlights the following aspects: threaded discussions. Threaded discussions means that when you have a discussion forum and you have people responding to a discussion for a question that I pose up, and then you respond to it, somebody else responds to it, somebody else may respond to your comment. That's what we call threaded discussions, right? Then improving students' postings, encouraging more postings, technology integration, new and old, learning activities, and the integration of social media, as we saw in one example, all these aspects impact the teaching and learning space well. So what I want you to do is provide a brief synopsis of Anderson's discussion on these issues, right? And think about these 5 elements and how you see it applying in your own context. And remember what we said last week is your context is the key to unpacking the study unit. We don't want generic elements. We want to see how it's applicable in your own context, right? And then we go on to the next element on mobile learning. And this for me is, I just wish I could just shift my focus onto this, simply on this, because I think there's so much potential for us in our country on mobile learning, even in our continent, considering the fact that it's one of the best ways to access learning. And as I said earlier, we haven't fully utilized this in South Africa. For some reason, we haven't actually engaged this to the level that it is. But what was interesting is that Professor Marcus Specht, and there's a video of his in the study unit as well. I actually hosted him as part of our Academic Development Open Virtual Hub Innovation Teaching and Learning series, and he did a session on rethinking mobile learning in a developing context. But he drew his examples on Netherlands, right? And now, one of the things is that when we think of mobile learning, the immediate thing comes that mobile learning is for developing countries, countries that don't have access to technology, countries that don't have good connectivity. That is the stigma behind mobile learning, right? But that's not actually true in the Netherlands. There's an entire policy in Netherlands that are actually forcing universities to move towards mobile learning. Because remember, mobile learning it typically embodies cell phones, tablets, iPads. It means devices that you can touch yourself into the learning space, right? And the Netherlands has actually initiated a policy on mobile learning being the foundation of the learning approach for distributed learning. And I thought to myself, a country such as the Netherlands could achieve this. Why can't we do this in our own South African context by starting to push universities to access mobile learning and to start using mobile learning as part of the distributive learning agenda? So somewhere along the line, we really need to think about mobile learning. And here, the article by A. Arrington, J. Arrington talks about authentic mobile learning in higher education, right? So here's a video, first one, which I put up. And what I would like you to do is watch this first video on defining what mobile learning is, right? And remember, mobile learning, M-learning, the concepts are interchangeably. So watch this video, and it unpacks very nicely of what it means to be mobile, to have mobile learning, right? Thereafter, I want to look at the philosophical and theoretical professional dimensions of learning, right? So for example, in mobile learning, right, you talk about philosophy, instructivist to constructivist, right? So the instructivist means the sage on the stage, lecturer standing in the front, dictating, and the student just receives those knowledge. To constructivist, to students start constructing knowledge in these own spaces on mobile, through mobile learning. Theory, behaviorist or cognitivist, to situated social constructivist and andragogical, right? If you looked at the first video on pedagogy, you'll find the andragogy concept also part of this. Course design now becomes from bounded scope and sequence to open-ended learning, environment, flexible content, time and place, fixed in educational institutions to distribute it to suit the context of the learner. And this is quite interesting, colleagues. I attended a seminar before, and I think that was 2015 it was, at the University of Open University of Shanghai. And their old philosophy is the idea of what they call ubiquitous learning, right? Ubiquitous. I'm sure some of you may have heard this concept, ubiquitous learning. And ubiquitous means you learn anywhere, anytime, anywhere. Anywhere, anytime, on any hour, meaning any device, right? There's no restrictions. So ubiquitous learning, the student could tap into their mobile device any time of the part of the day, night, whatever it is, learn. That kind of approach. So no time, no place, right? It is open, distributed. And that's what we also need to think about maybe in our own context as we are moving towards what we say the new norm, right? And we know we are moving towards a fourth wave of COVID-19 in our country. Europe is already experiencing it, and people are predicting that around December or so, certain parts of Africa are going to start seeing the fourth wave. But it means that we really need to think of a new norm in our educational context, our educational context. And this, for me, is one of the key things, is for us to start thinking of ubiquitous learning, how we can force our students or create those learning spaces to be ubiquitous, to go beyond time, beyond place. That, for me, is what we should start investigating and as part of technology integration in higher education. And if we start doing that, we will be able to start creating more spaces for our students to engage in at their own time and place. Tasks: decontextualize, concise, and self-contained to authentic, reflective, complex and sustained. Resources are fixed, chosen by a teacher, to open, chosen by learners with access to such tools. Support is teacher, and yes, support is community of learners. Now, you will see this is that for example, in the WhatsApp groups and even in our own WhatsApp groups, you don't have a facilitator that deals with the students. It's the students instructing, providing guidance to students through this. So support extends beyond the teacher. It doesn't replace the teacher. It extends beyond the teacher to communities of learners, right? Technology tools, fixed tools, located in learning spaces, to mobile, portable, ubiquitous, here's the concept here, available. Knowledge outcomes, facts, skills, innovation, to conceptual understanding, higher order learning, higher order cognitive skills, products, academic essays, exercises, or no tangible products, to authentic artifacts and digital products. Now, in the next study unit that we are doing, in fact, I wanted to do it in this study unit, but I thought to myself, this is a bit too much of content for me to integrate a digital learning object. But in the next study unit, what I would want you to do is, we're not going to do a written essay. I'm going to show you how, or what I'm going to request for you to create a digital learning artifact as part of the next one. And digital learning artifacts are digital learning objects or digital learning artifacts are the new ways of engaging and assessing students. So for example, one of the things I could ask you in the next study unit is to create a voice over PowerPoint or a podcast, which could serve as a digital learning object or artifact on a certain element of it, right? So it's moving beyond this. And why I want to integrate that as part of our assessment is, unless you do it yourself, you won't be able to apply it in your classroom context to get your students to do it, right? So that's one of the things that we want to do next week, is to look at how we create digital learning objects and the quality approaches behind it as well. Assessments, standard tests, standardized tests, examinations to performance-based, transfer of knowledge, stable knowledge adapted to different contexts, to new and changing knowledge. And this is the other thing, colleagues, is that in traditional modes where we are printing stuff, we are sending students study guides, etc., our knowledge is actually restricted because it takes us a year sometimes to develop those study guides, a year sometimes to develop our study material. And it means that when we start, we've already outlined our curriculum for the year, right? But with the technology, it allows us to, for example, if there's a new case study that's out, it allows us to immediately tap into that new case study, which is current, and integrate into our learning space, as opposed to what you can do in print, right? So this is the kind of advantages of technology integrated spaces. Professional learning, courses, groups, events, workshops, to personal, just-in-time, community-based learning. Oh yeah, and I like the concept just-in-time learning, because just-in-time also means if you're looking at some of the skills that are needed, we can actually tailor make our courses to the skills that are needed. So for example, if we are doing a course that can integrate digital literacy skills, etc., one of those skills, we can put those skills as part of our courses, right? And that means the just-in-time skills that are needed. Some current issues on mobile technology, some current uses of mobile technology in higher education. The standard SMS prompts notification, this is actually very costly. I know in our own institution where we said some of our modules are 20,000, 30,000 students, the SMS prompts are notification that goes to students. We use this at certain times when it comes close to examinations, assignments, to prompt students to check the learning management system or for due dates, but it's a costly element. I must stress this, it's a costly element for institutions. Polling classes, where you can do a WhatsApp simply polling class. Do you agree with this definition of the concept? So students can now find they can integrate technology as part of even their lectures in classroom, right? Pop quizzes, phone exams, voice print authentication or authentication or proctoring, which is used on our phone through our phones now. And I know there's been much debate, for example, if you follow the media on UNISA, specifically on the proctoring apps that are used at UNISA, students don't like it. They feel it's an invasion of their privacy. But on the other hand, as an institution, we are saying that for students, for us to ensure the authenticity of the qualification, we need an integration of proctoring apps. Then there are also other professional bodies, such as the engineering, accounting, that makes these proctoring apps as mandatory to ensure the quality of the assessment. So phones are now forming part of that, the proctoring apps, where an app is downloaded and the student is monitored through the phone app only for that particular period to watch what the student is doing through some kind of algorithms, etc., that it flags when a student is cheating. Ebooks, which you can read, and for example, you get Kindle, that are mobile applications as well, EPUB books, etc., that can be used off your phone or mobile device. RSS feeds, as I mentioned earlier, that allows for the integration of key themes, emerging uses that you can filter through the curation elements, and podcasts, as I mentioned right at the beginning, which is becoming quite critical. Now, the theoretical framework for integrating mobile learning, and the authors of the core text from Siemens and Sharps, Taylor, and Vavola. Learning and knowledge rest in a diversity of opinions. Learning may reside in non-human appliances such as technology. The capacity to know more is more critical than what is currently known. Nurturing and maintaining connections is needed to facilitate continual. Sorry, one second, colleagues. Okay. So currency is accurate, up-to-date knowledge, and we find that the intent of all connective learning activities. Then we also find, for example, in Sharp and Taylor's, is the idea of how different from current theories of classroom workspaces or lifelong learning. Does it account for the mobility of learners? That means, can learners learn through mobile devices? Does it allow learners to learn through different spaces, ubiquitous learning? Does it cover both formal and informal learning? Does it theorize learning as a constructive and social process? Going back right at the beginning, remember to our social learning. And does it analyze learning as personal situated activity mediated by technology? And here you got an activity. And what you need to do here is watch this activity by Marcus Specht. Now, as I mentioned, Marcus Specht is actually the leading voice in mobile learning, right? As I said, I brought him down in early parts of this year, actually. And I also actually had a term with him in Shanghai Open University, where he was also a visiting fellow. And he is brilliant. So if you go onto YouTube and search Marcus Specht, you'll find that he's got these excellent videos, right, on mobile learning. In this particular video, what I like about it, mobile learning, is he talks about augmented reality and virtual reality as part of mobile devices. Now, augmented reality, virtual reality, we all know what virtual reality means. You have this virtual space, we see it in video games, etc. Right? But augmented reality is quite interesting because he talks about how, for example, a course on urban landscapes or cities, right? On cities, where he's got some of these courses that run, but the students then can take their phone through an app. Like, for example, if you're in Pretoria and you walk through the Union buildings, right? And as you look at, as you're walking through that app in the Union buildings, etc., information on, for example, the statue of Nelson Mandela, the statue of the Union buildings, the history, all starts to appear as you are scanning through with your mobile device of the Union buildings. So at certain points in the, for example, in urban landscapes, important sites, it flags information to the student. And I thought this was actually fascinating because how he actually developed this was through a research project that he used with his students. So he had his students walk through the city, take photographs, snap photographs of important information, photos of it, for example, monuments, etc., then provide correct academic information about that monument statue, historical information, and then he mapped it in and he built this augmented space, right? So where students could now walk through the city landscape, and the moment it goes to that particular statue, the app immediately picks up and recognizes that statue as part of the information, and the student then gets the information about the history of that statue, when it was created, whatever it is, as part of this augmented reality. It's actually a fascinating way to now think about how technology goes beyond our classrooms and moves into a much more virtual space of engaging, but how it blends learning into these spaces. You may find, if any of you have been to the London Art Museum as well, you'll find a similar app that works where people are walking through the museum, and it prompts up wherever you are at that particular beacon in that location in the art gallery. It'll know exactly which direction you're photo, which image that you're looking at, and it gives you an history of it. So that kind of stuff that is now working. And imagine now if we had to integrate this as part of our learning, it opens up a complete new space for us. But it also allows us now to reconstruct knowledge, not colonized knowledge, but actually our own knowledge on these spaces, right? And for me, this is how technology creates an all new medium for us to think about knowledge production and also learning that occupies in these spaces. So please watch this video, but also do a search on Marcus Specht's other videos. He's actually quite good in this space, right? And then we move on to, colleagues, the next section. The next section is now on designing learning activities, right? So now we went through the different elements of what is mobile learning, what is social learning, what do we think of in terms of the idea of different elements of us being social beings. So we've really looked at the foundation of how technology is integrated, right? So we went to technology, embodied learning, social learning, learning technology, 3D pedagogy, communities of inquiry, mobile learning. And we know how all this fits in terms of technology and how it opens up new spaces for us to rethink technology. But now I want to actually show us how we apply some of these, one generic principle on how we design online activities, right? And now why I put this in is because one of the biggest challenges with us in our own institution, maybe you may find this in your own institution as well, is that to get students to participate online is a major challenge. Low participation rates in some cases, right? So how do we design learning activities that are able to build students' cognitive elements from an entry level to taking them up to now producing knowledge? So from basically engaging in platforms to producing knowledge, right? And that's what I want to show you in this particular subtheme. And here's another concept, colleagues. So the concept that I want to employ right at the beginning of this article here is on the idea of lurkers. Now, some of you may be familiar with the concept of lurkers, some of you may not, but a lurker, right? A lurker is somebody who logs onto the online platform. So you get two categories of online participants. You get active participants. Active participants, as the word simply means, people that are engaged online all the time, people that are on the space, answering questions, following discussion forums, feeding in. Those are active participants, right? But then what we call lurkers. Lurkers are people that log on, see what happens on the space, don't participate, but they read all the comments, they read the discussion forums, they read the posts. So those are lurkers. They lurk behind, but not actively participating, right? And one of the things that we realized is that when we did our stats in our own institution and we looked at how many people are actively online, and we realized that while the participation may be very low, that there are a lot of students that are actually accessing the stuff and reading what's happening, but they just don't want to engage actively on the platform. So that actually shows you that there are two subcultures that are emerging. One, that a group that people that are actively integrating technology, students that are actively using it, those students that are not yet confident enough, but they access it, they just see what's happening in the spaces. But during exam time, we found that a lot of these students who are lurkers now log on to see what's happening. They further engage because they know and they start to read what the other students have been posting up. They start to read what the lecturers' comments to those students' posts are. And that for us is quite critical, is that even if we have people lurking behind, as long as they're accessing the information, as long as they're on the platform, they may not be actively participating, but that's our ultimate goal. But as long as they are online, that's the first battle of us won in terms of a mindset shift in terms of our students. And that's quite critical for us, right? But we need to move our students from being lurkers into active participants. But that's also a cultural shift, a mindset shift that we need to engage with. So that's important for that you understand those two concepts of lurkers and active participants. Now here we talk about designing e-activities. E-activities is Gilly Salmons used the concept for online activities, right? So online activities, she simply coined this concept called e-activities, right? How do we design e-activities, online activities? So what I would like you to do is look at Gilly Salmon's two works, and they're available on this link, Introduction to E-activities. They're from our website. It's actually quite a good website as well. So Gilly Salmons is in Australia and one of the very leading voices in this particular space. And she talks about the 5-stage framework to how we develop e-activities, right? So there's two articles that I want you to look at quickly here. The one on introduction and the second one on 5-stage activities. Now, I've also posted up an interview here. It's in English, so don't worry about the German here. It's in English, where there's questions being asked to in a short interview before a conference on what are e-activities, are the potential of e-activities. So Gilly Salmons defines e-activities as the frameworks for enabling active and participative online learning by individuals and groups. So it's for both individuals and groups, right? But let's talk about active online participation. So Salmons explained e-activities as important for online teaching and learning. They focus on learners, enable enjoyable and productive online learning. Knowledge is constructed by learners through and with others. That's why she sees the main goals as this. Right? The following are some valuable propositions for e-activity that I would like to highlight for us in our own teaching and learning space, whether it's tutoring or teaching online, whatever it is, right? They enable academics, designers, curriculum developers, and teachers to design online participation by their students. They provide learners with an effective scaffold to support them in achieving learning outcomes. They enable learners and e-moderators to work together. They promote a learning-centered task, problem-based approach, online learning. They challenge and motivate participants to critique, contribute, review, and consolidate ideas. They increase learner engagement. They make course productive and fun. They easily deploy newer technologies such as social media as part of this. They easily find purposeful ways for using freely available, topical, and fun resources within the learning design. And they quickly incorporate sound pedagogical principles into teaching and learning. Right. So now, when we talk of designing activities, we talk about 3 stages. Right. So the first is storyboard. You need to think about the purpose and process of the activity and developing the draft format. So, and this is quite important. So, for example, if I had to ask you for a first activity, and going back to one of what our colleagues said, I could have said in this course, the first activity is to introduce yourselves to each other. We want to get to know who you are. So part of this tells us, post a picture of yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are, or post an interesting picture about yourself online on the discussion forum and tell us why you chose this picture, what does it express about you, and why you are taking this course, right? So that immediately tells me what is the purpose of and process of the first activity. It's to introduce participants to each other on the discussion forum. By doing that, I'm introducing participants to each other. I'm breaking the ice between participants online. Secondly, I am then inducting participants to use the discussion forum, which then allows them to gain the basic skills for further use of the discussion forums, right? So can you see how the activities are now building on, right? Scaffolding means that my activities must build on knowledge. Now, for example, if you watch the way I developed this particular course, I always refer back to what I did in the previous study unit. So, for example, in this study unit, I told you in the previous study unit, we discussed the 3 generations of pedagogy. In the previous study unit, we did that. That scaffolding allows us now to design e-activities that builds on knowledge, the learning sequence as part of this, which means that I can't just design discussion forums for the sake of designing discussion forums. The outcome of my discussion forums, the outcome of my activity must be part of a learning sequence that I am eventually leading to, right? And this is where you match it to the learning outcomes. Invitation. Am I writing in a way that it can be placed online for participants to follow? So remember what many of you have already stressed last week and some of you this week is that the challenges for students engaging online. If I write an instruction in such a technical way that it makes it very difficult for those students who are less digital competent to follow it, it means that those students are immediately sidelined. So the approach that I use to introduce technology to my students must allow for them to be accommodating of different competency levels, different skills, etc. Right? And that colleagues, that is a skill. Everybody, as time goes on, you find that you master that skill in how you integrate technology in an inviting way, as opposed to in the technical way that we start to put barriers up, right? There are 3 main role players in e-activities. So participants, those are learners who participate in the e-activities, the e-activity designer, the person who designs that design the activities, and then we also have the e-moderators. Now this is important because for those of you that are using teaching assistants, for example, or tutors, for example, that means your role as and I'm not sure if your campus actually uses this or if you are thinking about using this as part of your, especially with the large causes, but then your role, some of your roles in these spaces will shift from being the designer to the moderator, right? And the moderator basically intervenes to support the learning, to see what can be done to ensure that that learning activity is achieved by the student, how the student is actually engaging in that learning activity. And that's an interesting role because you're able to separate yourself from it and do the analytics part of it, to analyze how are students actually engaging with this learning activity? How are students actually responding as part of this technology that are integrated as part of this, right? So this is important that you actually see that third role as something that that you could have you could integrate. If you just have just have yourself, you can also assume this role as part of it. Okay, so let's look at the 5 stages framework and activities.
Sorry, Prof.
Yes, please.
I just want to check these moderators. Is it the same moderators that we normally see, you know, in the social medias like your Clubhouse, your YouTube? Those who will control the session and support the presenter.
Ah, you're clever, eh? Yes, same one.
Oh.
Same one. So, for example, Yeah, you would find those moderators, especially in, you get some of these news channels like Channel 24 or some of these newspapers where they filter the comments out before it can get posted. Some of your learning management systems allow that as well. And this becomes quite critical because you take on an ethical role, but it also can become a stumbling block because remember, sometimes you filter what goes out into the public space, right? So it means it's very selective knowledge that's going on in this public space. But in the context of a classroom, and I think this is where it can become quite critical. If you are doing the online activities, what it can do is allow you to monitor and make sure that the responses that the students are giving is fair, it's acceptable, it confines to the language that is used and appropriate for that space. So that's actually very, very important. So that's on point. Okay, so the 5 stages framework, right? So now this is important, and this is something that I've noticed many people make a mistake with, right? Is many of us, when we're designing our discussion forums, with the first activities, critically discuss this concept on the discussion forum, or critically explain what this particular author is saying about open distance e-learning or online technology or education in tech. Now, for a student who never engaged in a discussion forum before, they will find this a very daunting task because we haven't actually set them up from a bottom stage to build them up from a bottom space and let them move up into the space, into different stages. And this is what Gilly Salmons talks about. He says that when we design discussion forums, when we design online activities, we must think in terms of 5 stages that we move our students to, right? And the first step, she says, is access and motivation. The second step is online socialization. The third is information exchange. The fourth is knowledge construction. And finally is where we will leave our students at the end of it. They will be able to develop their own knowledge, right? These steps must be seen in a sequence in order for us, if we want effective integration of technology in our activities, right? Now, let's unpack some of these, right? So you find access and motivation. Access implies access to the online environment, sufficient knowledge to navigate the screen, right? Now, this is also talks about a level of digital skills, navigate the screen for purpose of difficult of learners, to have the basic IT skills. So access basically means that we're providing a level of skills for our students to engage in these online spaces, right? The second thing that he talks about is the motivation. If participants are not motivated, they will not participate, right? So you must be able to motivate your students right at the beginning. So she says that the very first activity that we design in online spaces should be to create and to allow students to access it and to motivate it. And remember what I gave you an example of students providing basic introduction to themselves, uploading a photo, etc. Now, just by doing that, I'll be able to access or evaluate whether they have the technology skills to upload a photograph, to post on a discussion forum, to save it on a discussion forum right at the beginning. And I can provide that technical level of support to my students who are finding challenges so that by the time they get to the next activity, they would have already mastered the skill. But if I don't allow that space for them to explore right at the first activity, it means they won't acquire that skill, and that can become a challenge, right? The second, when we design online activities, the second part is to think of online socialization. Now, socialization focuses on creating your own online micro community, and this means inviting participants from different parts to establish through activities, introductions, making participants comfortable, feel at ease, engage with each other. And something I think Naheem mentioned earlier, the idea of participants engaging internationally across, becoming friends on Facebook, sharing photos or whatever it is, right? That's part of socialization. And this is what we need to think about in the online space as well, is the idea of socialization in an online space, right? And that becomes quite critical because it renders to what we want to achieve as a community of practice for our students, right? Then only after we've got our students comfortable to use technology, they socialize, they can engage with their fellow peers, we can start moving to the next set of activities, which now allows for an information exchange, where we have students interacting with the content and interacting with fellow peers, right? This means that the 2 important skills here is knowledge for tools for remote access of information, content, and knowledge of strategies for personal information retrieval that we now can start building in as part of our assessment at the 3rd stage, right? The 4th stage, the 4th level is now knowledge construction. It is only at this point in our activities that we can start asking the students to critically analyze, to think critically, to be creative, to be practical, right? This is where they can now use the technology and harness the technology and the skills that they've got to build up this knowledge, ideas, to plan, to skill, to think of mixing skills, etc. as part of this process, right? And then finally, the fifth stage, which is the fifth set of activities that we can design, is where our participants move now from basic introduction to now actually developing knowledge online through collaborative spaces, to collective spaces, to accessing knowledges at different nodes, like of what John Simmons talks about, the connectivist theory. Is at this point that we can ask students to self-reflect, become self-reflective of how they produce knowledge, to understand the learning processes in their own resting place. It is at this point that we now talk about the fifth set of activities that we can design. So what Gilly Salmons talks about here, colleagues, is quite interesting, is that we need to rethink how we design activities. We can't just jump into the deep end of critical thinking, of analytical thinking in an online digital space, because there are different variables, there are different elements that defines how we engage in these spaces. And Gilly Salmons talks about these as building blocks, right? You're building your student to where you want your student to be in online, which means that your level of activities needs from lower cognitive levels to high cognitive levels. Low means stage 1 to high cognitive level, stage 5. That's how we need to also start thinking of how we're designing activities. And that's one of the greatest challenge for me that I find in academia, is we all want to jump to the critical thinking skills. We all want to jump to the idea of critically analyze, evaluate, assess, without building our students up to that point. And I think that's where we have the challenge of participation. If we don't create those building blocks, our students will not be able to participate in a proper online space that they've become accustomed to and grew into that space. This is what Gilly Salmons talks about, that approach. And I thought that is actually quite a profound example, because it's actually, it really talks about contextualizing the skills of our students, the knowledge of our students to this particular space. Okay, and then now, colleagues, the last part of this is the portfolio activity. And remember, as I said, colleagues, that every study unit has a portfolio activity. So this activity that I'm going to discuss now with you is the portfolio activity for study unit 3. And remember, you don't submit it now, colleagues, you add it as part of your portfolio, and you submit it with your portfolio when you submit your portfolio, right? So as in the previous assessments, I want you to apply the knowledge. So what I've done is given you 2 questions. Okay, I'll come back to the question just now, Bill. Okay, so assignment 2, portfolio question. Your second assignment is a portfolio, right? Now remember, as I mentioned, each study unit has a portfolio question. In each of your remaining study units, you will receive a portfolio activity. You need to complete this activity. Your portfolio is due on 24th of November. Remember, and I will give you a space to submit it online, right? So there are 2 questions, and I want to see how you apply the knowledge that you just get. So write an essay, firstly, in which you discuss the importance of mobile learning, right? Colleagues, remember mobile learning for the African higher education context. Now, here's a tip, colleagues. You're discussing mobile learning, so you will have to provide a definition of what mobile learning is, provide some idea of what are the principles of mobile learning. But remember, you need to contextualize it for the African higher education context. Now, here's a tip, colleagues. To motivate this, go and look at some of the stats of mobile access in our country and why in our continent, and why you think mobile access is important for the higher education context. And it's quite easy to pick it up, because you look at some of the mobile learning in African context, you will see that many scholars are saying that it's the easiest way for access, right? Everybody's got access to mobile devices. Our mobile penetration in this country is growing so fast. I mean, some people have 2 or 3 phones. And in fact, I ask some of you that are part of our group right now, how many of you have 2 or 3 phones? I can guarantee you a lot of you would say 2 or 3 phones, right? So mobile learning for the African context. So I want you to unpack what mobile learning is. You should also discuss in your approach the elements of social learning and embodied learning. Remember, what is a social learning, what is embodied learning, Ubuntu, etc. So this question actually forces you to rethink mobile learning in African context, social learning, embodiment, and come up with one concise response. Same length as previous assignments, minimum 5 resources. Same rubric that I'm using as well, colleagues. So you've now already should become familiar with the rubric that we're using as part of this, right? So when I say, colleagues, also when I say references minimum 5 resources, it means I want to see minimum. That means at least 5 resources, but you're not restricted to 5. You can act anything more than that is possible, right? Then question 2, for this activity, imagine you are the facilitator of this online tutoring course, right? So training course, tutoring course, whatever it is. So I want you to do this. I want you to choose any part of this course from study unit 1 to 3, right? So anything that you've covered from study unit 1 to 3, introduction, theoretical principle, and today's what, innovation. And then I want you to design an activity of your choice for your fellow peers. Okay, so remember, anything from study unit 1 to study unit 3, any element, any aspect that you want to focus on, you got a free range of choices, right? I want you to design one activity, online activity. Any activity that you want. Look at some of the online activities that I've given you as an example, but I want you to design any activity, but I want you to apply Gilly Salmon's elements. So if, for example, you tell me this assignment, this learning activity is based at stage 1, then tell me you're developing in stage 1, right? So in completing, I've given you sources that you can check. So in completing this activity, you should consider the following components of an activity, but not limited to this. I want you to give me a title of your activity. What is the purpose of your activity? The task, what instructions are you giving to your students, right? Where do you want your students to complete this activity? Remember, you must tell the student. Now, if you look at whenever I give you an activity, I did tell you to post on the discussion forum, post in the comments tab, or post in the chat room. You must give your student precise instructions where to complete that activity. This is part of the design element in online space, is that we tell our students, you must complete this activity on the discussion forum, because we're pointing our students where we want them to do technologically, the digital navigation of the space, right? Word count. Now, what I find is that when I do these activities, I prefer word count so that I am able to allow all students to have a fair amount of words, right? So I found that if I don't tell the students word count, then what happens is I'll have a student who gives me 1,500 words, and I'll have a student who gives me 500 words. But the fact that I never disclose how many words I want, I can't mark it less than whatever I've achieved. So by being very specific with word count, I'm able to create a fair space for all students to be assessed. Due date. Now, remember, this is your learning activity, so you can give any due date that you want to. What I'm trying to see here is that if you accommodated enough time for your students to complete the activity. So, for example, if you tell your students to read something and then discuss something, you must give your students enough time for them to engage with that content. Guidance and feedback, how would you provide this to your e-tutor, to your students, and completing the activity, right? So remember, title, purpose, the task, the instructions you want for your student, where to complete the activity, word count, due date, and what guidance and feedback would you give? General feedback, your colleagues, you don't need to kind of say, okay, discuss this and then provide a complete paragraph or 2 paragraphs on what you expected the student. Your feedback can even be 2 or 3 points. That's feedback, right? So, but the feedback must be precise. So all we want to see is that you integrate technology, but you're able to use technology as part of a learning process in designing these activities. So remember, you're not restricted. Some people, some people have actually done blogs, asked a blog activity, some have discussion forums, some have even used wikis. If you're familiar with what wikis is, you can use wikis. Some have actually said post a 2-minute video clip explaining X, Y, Z. So PS could see the kind of instructional design process behind how you're thinking through this online activity, right? So that's the activity that you're going to. Remember, this one has 2 activities, and your total, each activity I'll mark out of 100%, but it will be converted to 20% of the final portfolio mark, right? So both marks will be equal marks, but your total of both will be then combined and divided and weighed out to 20% for your portfolio activity. So colleagues, this is your study unit, and I hope you can now actually, when you finish, go through it on your own time and look at it more critically and some of the text and engage with more specific readings that I've put as part of this. So remember, next week's one, I will discuss the remaining 2 study units, but next week, Friday, I'll put up the remaining 2 units and the conclusion. And then that will be actually our last session next week before you start finalizing your assessments. Okay, so I see a question. Bele, I'm wondering if we are able to do our notes on Moodle like yours on MOOC. I like them being online like this with activities at the end. It will be a nice way to track student participation. At the moment, we just upload PDFs. Yeah, that's the problem. Bele, everybody uploads PDFs behind class, and it's not online learning. That's just disseminate. When we upload PDFs behind class, we're simply creating a new medium for students to access what we would have normally given them in print. But in this approach, it's actually designing an online course where you are designing links, hyperlinks, you're designing activities for the students to do. And why I even opted for this approach as opposed to kind of giving you a printed PDF study guide is that I honestly believe that if you don't have the experience of an online course, as we are doing it now, you won't be able to conceptualize what an online course is in your mind. So this was part of my rationale behind taking you to this online course, creating some of these learning processes behind it, so they can actually see how technology is integrated as part of a learning process in an online learning environment, and how this becomes your medium as an extended learning space. Moodle, you can actually do the exact same thing with Moodle. Actually, this is Sakai that we're using. And UNISA is actually migrating to Moodle from January next year. But Moodle layout is slightly different, but the same elements that we've got now of creating discussion forums, etc., is the same process that you can do on Moodle by creating blocks. So the learning management systems have much potential. And one of the reasons why we are moving to Moodle is because of the technological affordances that Moodle has as compared to Sakai. It's much more. And one of the key elements for me, which is something that I am very much in favor of, is the idea that we can gamify some of the elements of our teaching, where students can gain a badge, for example, after every study unit, and have 5 badges, which at the end of the course, instead of having a portfolio, all I would have done was give you at every study unit, say, collect a badge. By the time you finish this course, you would have had 5 badges, which would have given you your course grade for this. So you can actually allow for that kind of gaming element of your courses as well. So Moodle offers a variety of opportunities in there. So I think, I think that's a good way to actually explore some of the elements. But colleagues, this is typically how one would design an online course. Learning outcomes, key questions, your text, your main core text, your core readings, activities, all on one centralized space as part of your learning approach. Yes, so colleagues, thank you very much. Let me open up for any questions, any comments that we have before we close. Any questions, comments, colleagues? Any clarification? Anything, colleagues? Anything on what we've discussed so far? Your last comments on it? Nothing. In terms of the portfolio, are you all comfortable with the portfolio question? Thanks, Prof. Mposa.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, thanks for the talk, for the lecture. I wanted to. I've seen that, but at least you brushed it, on it. On the, I see that the submission of the portfolios regarding assignment 2, which is starting from activity 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I was seeing that activity 5 is likely to be on the 24, 26, on that week ending 26, and we are supposed to submit by 26. But I think you have highlighted that you may cover it next week. So I'm not sure if it is possible to put them together and or to combine the 2 activities and also the portfolios.
Yeah, next week what I'll do next week is I'm gonna basically tell you, I'm gonna lay out the portfolio and tell you that your portfolio consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. These are the marks for the questions. This is what's expected from you for this question. So next week what I'm gonna do is literally break down your portfolio for you. So by the time I finish that Friday, you will have a very clear understanding of what is expected for you in your portfolio, how you should number your questions, and also the mark allocation for everything.
Okay. Yeah. At one time I was thinking, is it possible to write as a narrative? But I think it won't be as one narrative. But I think in this case, the way it is designed, it won't be possible. That means we will have based on a separate unit, we'll have a portfolio and possibly up to its references, then another portfolio. And so I think, as you are saying, we may number them to say 1, 2. It can work.
So what I'll do is I'll give you the numbering. So I'll say you study unit 1, portfolio question 1, study unit 2, portfolio question 2. So I'll break it down for you next week, and I'll give you that as a guideline, so you can use that as a checklist when you are submitting your portfolio.
Okay. When did you start from study unit 2? Because study unit 1, I think, was a different.
Yeah, study unit one. Study unit one was your first assignment, right?
Yes.
That
yes.
assignment is done. So you only will do now study unit 2, study unit 3, study unit 4, study unit 5, and then the conclusion is a journal entry on your experience in the course. So you only so your portfolio. Yeah. Remember your portfolio question. In this study units, you've got slightly more essay questions, and you got an essay question, and you got activity. In the other two study units, it's a little bit less work.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it will do. Yeah. So I think once you summarize it and also the general conclusion part, next week it will be clear.
Perfect. Yeah, I just want you to work with whatever the portfolio. So even if you are starting to work with your drafts on these portfolio cases, it's fine. Just go ahead and work with it. But then when we meet next week Friday, we'll consolidate exactly how the portfolio needs to look like.
Thanks, Prof.
Pleasure. Okay, thanks, Prof. Colleagues, any other questions? Nothing else? I should. Okay, thanks. Busisiwe, floor is yours. You can unmute.
Thank you, Prof, for the lecture. I'm a bit confused. Where do we access this information?
Sorry, which information?
This information for the portfolio and everything.
Okay, so did you go and create an account here? Log on to the account here onto the UNISA Open Learning Space. Did you enroll for this course?
Yes.
Okay, so when you
have this website of UNISA.
Okay, so when you logged on the course, did you log on to this course, Educational Technology in Higher Education?
No, Prof.
Okay, so what you need to do is, I sent a video on the WhatsApp, right?
Okay.
And on the WhatsApp, it was the video of last week. And last week's video, I actually showed the colleagues how to create an account, how to find this. Okay, actually, you don't even need to create an account. You know, if you looked at your email address, your email, I would have sent you login details.
Okay.
Right? And I would have sent you the address. All you do is you go to this address, https://mooc.unisa.ac.za. Use the user ID that I gave you. And I think the user ID is your email address, your DUT email address is a user ID. And then your password is DUT 2021. And you log on, you will have full access to this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, please do it quickly, because remember, next week is our last two study units and the conclusion. So you'll have a bit, it's a bit to catch up on. Okay, thanks. Sam, floor is yours. Sam? Sam, the floor is yours. You unmute. I can see you unmute. You can chat. Sam, can you hear me? If you can't hear me, Sam, or you have a difficult. Sam, can you hear me?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you now, Sam.
Okay. Thank you.
Sam, you mute, Sam.
I'm saying, could you please leave your email? I want your email address. Oh,
okay. So my email address is, Sam, just WhatsApp me and I will give you my email address.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. So colleagues, this is your assessments, etc. But remember, colleagues, this is an education technology. All I want to see is competency. I want to see that you can apply it in your own context. I want to see that you gain understanding of the knowledge. It's not I'm not looking for too very technical eye-level discussions, etc. So the idea is application of the knowledge that you've gained in terms of this module itself. Okay, so that's it, colleagues. So next week we will discuss the next two study units, study unit 4 and 5, and the conclusion and the portfolio. But I think it's actually we've made good progress in terms of what we need to achieve with this. So colleagues, for those of you that have not yet accessed the online course, please go and look at it. I can see there's some of the colleagues that are doing excellent work in terms of the discussion forums already and chat tools, etc. So good work with that, colleagues. Congratulations on your engagements with that. So colleagues, from my side, thank you very much. We will meet next week. So colleagues, next week I think we can meet at 9 o'clock unless we have any load shedding. I'll let you know, but I think we should be fine for our 9. I would actually prefer us meeting at 9 a.m. If we have load shedding, I'll make a provision, because I think next week we've got a bit more to discuss, and I would like to spend some time on the portfolio as well.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Yeah, I think another thing that will help when I look at how you did the assignment 1, there was a on the tutorial letter, it was more general, but in the session it was clearer.
Yes, that's why it's very important that you. Thanks for that. It's very important that you actually attend the sessions or look at the recordings as well. But I will also will unpack that, because you can submit your assignment 1 and your portfolio at the same time on the 24th. We can discuss some of the assignment as well for those that haven't submitted as well yet. So we can discuss some of those. But it'll also be good to share some for those that have already submitted, to also share your experiences with the assignments as well next week. But thanks for that. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, colleagues. So as I said, we will touch base next week at 9 a.m. And I will release the last 3 study units next week. And for those of you that can, please start working with your portfolio questions specifically, so that you kind of lessen the work on yourself at the end of the day. But it's been great being with you this morning, colleagues. And also thank you very much for some of your responses and your innovative ways in which you are using technology. I commend you on that. Really good work on that. And thank you for sharing that. Colleagues, have a restful weekend. Hope you get some good rest, and please be safe. And I will catch each one of you next week. So take care, colleagues.